A question I get a lot is, how do I rig up my phone to do a documentary or shoot sports? And so today we're going to look at this gear right here and figure out the best approach to shoot that kind of work. Now, before we get into it, understand this is completely subjective. You could rig your phone out in a million ways. Well, maybe not a million, but a lot of ways, because it really just depends on what ecosystem you bought into and what gear you own. However, what I'm going to suggest here could be mixed and matched with other stuff, other brands. So keep that in mind as we go through it. Now, first and foremost, you need the phone, and this is a 16 Pro Max. And so you could do this though with any phone. It doesn't have to be an iPhone. It could be an Android. It could be an older iPhone. But the one thing I do like for doing documentary and sports type work with these newer phones, really since the iPhone 14 Pro or Pro Max actually, is it has the longer telephoto lens. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But again, Androids have similar benefits depending on the make and model. So you need a phone, you need a case, and this is a Moment case. And again, this could be whatever kind of case you want really. I like this one because of this gadget right here, which we'll talk about momentarily. Again, one thing to keep in mind, when I'm talking about documentary and sports, I'm really talking about running and gunning. So you're shooting B-roll mainly, not interviews. This is really for shooting B-roll or coverage of an event, like a football game, a basketball game, or maybe you're doing a wildlife documentary. This could be a B camera, or it could be the main camera. So I've got my phone in my case, and then I like to have a grip of some kind. And this is a B-Script Pro. And this is where it gets really subjective. I like this one because it's universal and overall it's really easy to use. And this is a Beast handle. And I always use a Beast handle when I'm holding a grip like this. And I do that no matter what cage I'm using. That way you got a grip here and you can get a grip on the side. Now with the B-Script Pro, this is what I call the half cage, and I like this one the best. It has an additional side that comes over here to add lenses. But in this situation, we're going more of a minimalist setup. So I won't be adding any lenses. So then you put your phone in. And now what I like to do is use this. This is a Quick Lock V&D filter. One of the number one things people make a mistake with when shooting iPhone video is they don't use an ND filter. Now you don't have to, especially inside, but if you're shooting outside and any kind of bright light, you absolutely want to use an ND filter and it will make your footage look that much better. And the Moment one just clicks on like that. And now you have I believe it's a 2 to 5 stop, might even be 2 to 7 stop. Yep, 2 to 7 stop V&D filter on your phone. So that way you get ideal motion blur when you're shooting. And that's just really important, in particular, again, with an iPhone, because the shutter changes to adjust the exposure. And so if you get that really fast shutter look, that's not good. So we got our grip here, we've got the case, we got the V&D filter. And the one thing you don't want to skimp on, even if you're just shooting B-roll, is a microphone. And so I like to use a little shotgun mic. This is a Rode, but you could use whatever brand you want. I also like Sennheiser. And again, keep in mind that we're talking about shooting more B-roll or even grabbing some, quasi interviews, man on the street stuff. So you could use this setup or you could use a wireless mic. But for B-roll, I like a shotgun mic. So you plug that in and now you've got a nice documentary or sports iPhone setup here. Now, one note, if you want to capture stereo audio, let's say you're out in the woods by a creek and you want to get some ambience, then go ahead and use the iPhone mics. The iPhone mics are stereo. This is a mono mic. And so it just depends on what you're doing, but a stereo mic can be good. But if you're recording anyone's dialogue, like if you're grabbing sound bites or if you're getting nat sound, people talking in a crowd or whatever, I would definitely recommend using a shotgun mic. All right, we've got the gear set up now, but to make it all really work well on a phone in particular, you need to make sure you pick the right app. And I like the Blackmagic camera app. Now, I'm not going to do a full tutorial here. If you're interested in learning about the Blackmagic camera app, I actually have a course, the complete guide to learning the Blackmagic camera app. I'll put a link for that in the description if you're interested. But just as a general rule, why you want to use a third-party app is you have more manual control over the settings. You can not only set your shutter, you have control over your ISO, you can control your white balance, you can control the frames per second if you want to shoot some slow-mo. There's just a lot more control in a third-party app. And not to mention, you can choose different codecs if you want. One thing about using the native app is it only records, if you're shooting Apple Log, it only records in ProRes HQ, which those files are huge. What I often do, as I've got set up right here, is I shoot in H.265 in Apple Log, then you get much more manageable files. It depends on what I'm doing. If I'm doing something more on the pro level, whether it's going to be color graded or heavy color graded or visual effects, then I will shoot ProRes, but I might shoot ProRes 422 instead of ProRes HQ, even ProRes LT. So you have the choice in here, but I'm surprised at how well the H.265 looks even when color grading in Log. Another big thing for shooting sports, and this is why I mentioned at the beginning about the later generation phones, is you have the different lens options. So now, of course, not only do you have the big wide angle, which all phones have pretty much in the last few years, but you also have, and this is really important, you've got a 5x. So you've got the 5x tele built into this camera. And then, of course, you've got the standard 24mm. And as a side note, the 24mm is the best camera and you'll do the best in low light. But then you also have this 48mm, so a 2x zoom that's still in the same sensor. And so by using the main sensor, you can jump in twice. But let's say you're shooting, again, like a football game or a basketball game. Having the 5x telephoto is really great and makes shooting documentary or sports or even news. I didn't mention news, but documentary and news could overlap a little bit. Makes it a lot better having these various focal lengths. And I mentioned the 24mm is the best. Keep in mind that the 5x, while it's really good outside, it's not as good inside. But if you need to use it, I would go ahead and use it. Like let's say you're shooting a basketball game in an auditorium and it's kind of dark. I think it's still worth using it because that way you can get a longer reach. The other thing you can do is you do have a digital zoom in this app. And I would advise you not to use it a lot because as you zoom in, it does degrade the image. But again, if you need a shot, like again, cross court or something's way in the distance, you got it to 15x there. So that's pretty nice. And it could come in handy again in documentary or sports when in those situations, it's more about getting the shot than really worrying about the quality. And the quality will still be good. It just won't be as good and it'll get noisy too, but at least you'll have the shot. So using a third-party app, whether it's Blackmagic or Cinema P3 or whatever you choose, is really important, really no matter what you're shooting, but in particular, if you're doing anything more professional, shooting a documentary or maybe a sporting event. Now, a few optional items you might consider depending on what you're doing. Number one would be an SSD. Shooting to an SSD is a great way, especially if you're shooting a lot of footage, to easily transfer it and then also be able to have a lot of space, especially if you're shooting ProRes, because the phone will fill up pretty quickly, but an SSD will give you a lot more shooting time. And again, you can connect it right to your computer and either start editing off of it, or you can just transfer the files. And so an SSD is something that I really do recommend, and I've gotten to where I shoot with it a lot. Now, another one would be a monitor. Now, you've got the iPhone monitor, of course, but setting up an external monitor sometimes, especially if you're outside in bright light, that way you can see the image better, and of course, you can tilt the monitor. So you could mount this on top, and if you had the phone down low, you could then adjust the monitor and see the image, just like with a traditional camera. Now, the iPhone monitor actually is bigger than this one. This one's from SmallRig, but this connects wirelessly, and so you could actually step away from the phone. If you were, again, covering an event and you had the phone on a tripod, you could see what you were shooting, or you could have a client or whoever be watching, or you could be watching if someone else was shooting. But really, just having it connected to your phone right with you is great. And if you didn't want to use this one, because it is wireless, you could get a hardwired one that's HDMI, and you could use a hub. Because if you're going to use the SSD and a microphone, you'll need a hub anyway. Now, this Lexar has a little mini hub, which works well, or you could use a larger hub. But to connect all the peripherals, you'll need to do that. And now the last thing, and to use this, you would need a different case because the Moment case won't work. But this is the Reflex 240mm lens, and so it's a 10x equivalent, and it works on the 5x telephoto. So if you're shooting sports especially, but even documentary, having a long look like this could be really beneficial. It's a 17mm mount, and so it is more or less universal. You could use the Reflex case, you could use a Sandmark case, you could use a cage, the Beast cage, or any cage that takes 17mm mount, which most all of them do now. But it is really limited to the 5x tele, and so you get an amazing long throw, but the nice thing is you also get more shallow depth of field, and you just get a long lens look that you don't typically get with an iPhone. So do you shoot documentary or sports or news with your iPhone? And if so, what kind of setup do you have? I got links in the description for all the gear mentioned in this video. And again, keep in mind, you can use really whatever gear you want, just keeping these general guidelines in mind.